Welcome to this new series of the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins. In this series, we'll be taking a look inside Europe, looking at the role that social media disinformation is playing in the rise of populist politics, and also the role of disinformation campaigns organised by the Russian state targeting other countries as well. In each show in the series, we'll be taking a deep look at the situation in different European nations. But for this first show, we'll be discussing these issues together and how they affect Europe and the rest of the world. I'll be joined by Anne Applebaum, the historian and writer, Chris Steele, the former British intelligence officer and author of the Trump-Russia dossier, and Phil Howard, the director of the Oxford Internet Institute and the author of a book focusing on social media disinformation called Lie Machines. We'll also be hearing from our regular Infotagion podcast guest, Charles Creel. But Anne, I wondered if I could come to you first. I read and very much enjoyed your book, The Triumph of Democracy, published last year, which I think sets out many of the issues that countries across Europe, but particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, face from the rise of increasingly one-party states and the victory that democracy had when the Berlin Wall came down and in the 90s, where we thought that liberal democracy was on the march and an inevitable success would come, that those gains have been reversed. And tell me, what do you think is the real threat to democracy as we've known it since the end of the Cold War in Europe today?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to the program. And very amusingly, you misread the title of my book in a significant way. You described it as The Triumph of Democracy rather than The Twilight of Democracy.
Oh, sorry, I said twilight. It's probably my pronunciation.
No, you said twilight. It's okay. It's actually an interesting slip of the tongue because really one of the themes of my book and one of the important really themes of European politics at the moment is the fact that over the last 30 or 40 years, and really in the case of the US and the UK over the last 60 or so years, all of us became very complacent about liberal democracy. We assumed, and there were political science theories to back this up, that once a nation had achieved, a certain number of free elections and a certain number of, ticked off number of particular boxes, once it had joined the European Union, once it became a member of NATO, that there was no backtracking. There was no going back to some other form of government. And actually, historically, of course, that's not true. Over history, most democracies have failed. And the history of democracy in a lot of European countries, you look at somewhere like Greece, is circular. You have democracy, then you have a period of autocracy, then you have, a civil war, and then you have an invasion, and that's how politics has gone, going all the way back to the Athenian Republic. And the idea that we had somehow achieved something that was now permanent and never needed to be worried about again, and we could all go off and paint paintings or earn money or whatever we were going to do. We wouldn't have to worry about politics because a professional class of politicians would take care of it for us. That's turned out to be wrong. And it's become clearly wrong. I mean, your program is about Europe, so we're not talking about the US, but it's manifestly wrong inside the United States, where you have a major backlash against the American electoral system and against some of the tenets of liberal democracy itself. And it's also true here in Poland, which is where I am now, and Hungary as well. Both Poland and Hungary have elected governments, so you can't describe them as outright autocracies, but they're countries where in both cases, elected political parties, once they took office, proceeded to change the rules of the game to ensure that they would not lose again. And you had this phenomenon in Hungary going back many years now. In Poland, it's more recent and actually has happened more dramatically. Where the ruling party changed the rules of the court system, put in its own members of the Polish Supreme Court, took over state media, the equivalent of the BBC, and made it into kind of really very harsh. I think it would be surprising to British readers, to British listeners, to know exactly what kind of propaganda goes out on Polish state television. It's extremely xenophobic. It can be anti-Semitic, and it can be, they run smear campaigns against particular people and groups, and they took over a number of institutions that were meant to be neutral or were meant to ensure the balance of the system. They were meant to ensure a kind of even playing field for different political parties. And by doing so, they hoped to stay in power indefinitely. In the case of, in a number of countries, once this kind of political party has been in power for long enough, it becomes impossible for them to ever lose. I mean, that's the situation, for example, in Venezuela, where you also had a democratic system that was taken apart in that case by a left-wing populist authoritarian party, not a right-wing one. But the method is always the same. The method is a party comes to power. It says, we are the only ones who deserve to rule. We represent the real people, the real country. Our opponents are elites or foreigners or traitors, and therefore we deserve to change the rules to make sure that we won't lose next time. And that is what's happened in Hungary. It's what's happened in Poland. And there are other parties using that kind of language all around Europe and in the United States.
And why do you think this has been so successful in countries like Poland and Hungary in particular? Although we'll be looking at other countries in Eastern Europe where there are similar trends emerging. Is it because the institutions of democracy in those countries were not sufficiently strong and robust in order to withstand this sort of assault from a governing party?
I actually really disagree with that interpretation. I think the fact that it's happened in Poland and Hungary is somewhat of a coincidence. Was to do with the nature of politics in those two countries. And I think what's happened to the Republican Party in the United States is not as different as you would think. And so I do think that this kind of populist politics can work anywhere. I could well imagine it working in Italy. I could imagine it working in France. I can imagine it working in numerous other countries that have been democratic for a long time. I don't think it's specific to Central Europe. And I don't think it's something to do with being a former communist country. I mean, there are other former communist countries where you don't have exactly the same kind of problem. So it was to do with the nature of the politicians and the nature of politics in those countries.
So in some ways, we should look at what's happening in some of these countries, particularly say Poland and Hungary, as you've highlighted, and look at them as a warning to understand the situation there could get worse in terms of democracy being further undermined, and that recipe, as you say, could be replicated almost anywhere.
I really do believe that. Yes, it could be replicated almost anywhere, and nobody is immune to it. Not even the world's oldest and most stable democracies. Again, look at the United States, and the formula is one that's easily copied. There's no question that the Hungarians learned a lot from the Turks, from Erdogan's party, which staged a similar kind of progressive slow coup inside Turkey. He saw Turkey as a kind of model. The Poles see the Hungarians as a kind of model. And I've heard, American Republicans talking about Hungary as a model. Tucker Carlson, who's an American television host, a Fox News host, was in Hungary a few weeks ago, broadcasting from Budapest and saying what a wonderful country and what a great system it was and how we should all emulate it. So, these ideas, just in the way that democracy spreads and democratic ideas spread, maybe we can talk about that too, but the techniques and tactics of overthrowing democracy can also be very easily copied and are being copied now.
I'm joined by Chris Steele here in the studio, and you've heard what Anne has had to say there. You've been a constant observer and sounded warnings about Russia's the role of Russia in exploiting these tensions in other countries. How is Russia looking for partners, clients in other European countries? Does Russia, do you believe, have a strategy to deliberately go in and exploit? But actually, before we get on to that, which is principally what I wanted to ask you about for this show, obviously we have a very topical situation at the moment with the collapse of the government in Afghanistan. When we looked at the Russian intervention in Ukraine a few years ago, there was a clear Russian strategy around that. Do you think, we're looking at Afghanistan now, we can see, before we get back onto Europe, we can see similar activity at play, similar Russian interference and disinformation around what's happened in Afghanistan?
Yeah, thank you for having me on the programme. I think that when you look at the failure or the weakness of democracy as it's being exposed now in Europe, you do have to go back to the failure of democracy in Russia itself. Because certainly after 91, the country was moving in the sort of direction that we had all hoped it would move. There was a genuinely free press. There were contested elections, even if not perfect. But I think what was missing from the equation was the independent judiciary. And I think the more I've seen these processes develop, the more I'm firmly of the belief that democracy's sort of backbone, if you like, is the independent judiciary. And that was never established in Russia through the 1990s. And that's why I think Russia was easily turned around, or relatively easily turned around, by authoritarianism after Putin came to power in 2000. In terms of Afghanistan and so on, I think people have to realize that there's an ideological battle going on out there in which Russia and other countries like China view conflicts like the Syrian situation, like the Afghan situation, as almost like proxy wars. They talk about us and them. And we're sitting on the back of what the Russians would argue was their victory in Syria and is now Western and in particular an American defeat in Afghanistan. And I think the impact of that in general is to encourage them in interference and in bad behavior and in breaking the international norms that we've come to accept. And I would fully expect that in Afghanistan, for example, will be used, exploited by the Russians, who are very adept at tactical maneuvering and riding waves that are already in existence, to their advantage and to our disadvantage. And I think part of the problem that underlines this is a lack of deterrence. That my own view actually is that Russia doesn't have a particularly credible or coherent strategy of interference. It's much more tactical and opportunistic than that, but they will keep pushing until they come up against a brick wall. And so far, they haven't come up against a brick wall, so they will continue on.
And so do you think Anne has talked about Poland and Hungary in particular, Italy as well. There's been a lot written about Russian influence in those countries. Do you think Russia is deliberately seeking to further those networks and exploit political divisions within countries in Europe?
Absolutely. But as I said, it's a policy, or it's an operation which has been built up through experience and through sort of tactical manipulation. And, when you look at what Russia's sort of overall strategy is, I think you have to look at 2014 and the Ukrainian intervention as a watershed, because up until 2014, I think I would argue that Russia did have some interest and some motivation to be accepted as part of the international community and the sort of rules of the game community. I think once we got past 2014, Russia was over the hill and down the other side into the world of what we would call rogue states, and really lost a lot of its incentive to play by the rules. And also, I think, and something that Western politicians are very reluctant to accept or to understand, is that certainly key institutions in Russia post-2014 have regarded themselves as at war with the West. And some of their behavior, if you look at, the blowing up of arms dumps in Czech Republic, or the Skripal operation and so on, are testimony to that attitude, which is now, I would say, dominant within many of the power structures in Russia.
I think the interesting question is to what end? If we'd talked about this sort of Russian activity during the Cold War, there was a Soviet strategy to see a communist world, to see more countries go communist and part of the Russian Soviet sphere of influence. The Putin regime doesn't seem to be underpinned by any particular political philosophy other than the gaining and holding of wealth and power. What are they looking to achieve in Europe?
I think they're looking to guard their regime and their ill-gotten corrupt financial wealth, which is a massive issue. And it's something we need to talk about in this series, because I believe it was probably what started the interference, because Russian leadership is a kleptocracy. The leaders have hidden wealth, disguised wealth. They have to get that wealth out of the country and invested abroad without being prevented from doing so and exposed from doing so. But if you have strong institutions in the West, and if you have united policies in the West to combat that sort of thing, then that's very detrimental to the interests of the elite that's ruling Russia. And it is a kleptocracy. And at the end of the day, what I think the last sort of 5-10 years has proven is that money is a much more powerful tool of recruitment and disruption than ideology ever was under the Soviet Union.
So, similar to what Anne, I was going to ask, actually, I'm going to ask Chris about what you'd said, but I'll come to you directly on that is, I mean, do you see similar things here in countries like Russia, in Poland and Hungary? You said earlier on that it's really about sustaining a political party in power rather than the championing of a particular political philosophy.
So I would just like to diverge, sort of comment slightly on what Christopher Steele just said, because I think actually there's a more specific Russian agenda in Europe, and it's one that your British listeners should understand. The Russian agenda is, I mean, he's of course right that the real goal is regime preservation. But to preserve the regime, the Russians feel that two things are key. One of them is the breakup of the European Union, and the other is to get the Americans to leave Europe, so effectively end NATO. And towards that end, I mean, and once you understand that, and once you understand why that is, a lot of their actions that otherwise seem quite random begin to make sense. So first of all, why do they want these things? I mean, the European Union is a problem for Russia for two reasons. One, because Russia by itself, when it negotiates with any European power, is either equal or stronger. When it negotiates with the EU, it's much weaker. And whether that affects, gas or other trade issues or other kinds of issues, they're very well aware of that. The European Union is also a problem for Russia because of what it symbolizes. It symbolizes the triumph of liberal democracy, the possibility of integration, the possibility of peaceful, borderless trade, all things which would normally be appealing to Russians. What was it that really upset Putin in 2014 when he saw lots of Ukrainians protesting with EU flags and anti-corruption slogans and pro-democracy slogans? It was the idea that that kind of movement could easily take place in Russia too. A Ukraine that wants to be part of Europe, is a problem for Putin because he worries that Russia would want to be part of Europe. And so his goal is to undermine the EU as an institution and also to undermine democracy as an idea, as an ideal. And that's when we talk about regime protection, those are the tactics. The goal is to keep himself in power. And therefore, towards that end, he is willing to support anybody, far left, far right, separatist. And in that sense, it's non-ideological. But anybody who's willing to help him towards those goals. So anybody anti-European, anybody anti-American, anybody, Catalan separatists. There's strange, Russian attempts to influence Scottish nationalism. Anything that could break up the existing system, anything that could undermine the existing powers. This is what I do. And this, of course, was the Russian interest in the Brexit campaign. Again, I happen to not think that Russia was a key player in the sense of, I think there were a lot of other things going on and it wasn't that important, but that there was Russian disinformation that was pro-Brexit is an established fact, and that there were, Russian attempts to influence that discussion is established. As I said, I don't think they were key or necessarily, that they didn't swing the argument, but that explains why. Because for Russia, Brexit was, wonderful. It created this, multi-year conflict between Britain and its allies. It destroyed the solidity and solidarity of the West. It was one more distraction. It was one more thing one more element to undermine Europe. And so when you look at Russia's strategy, that's it. It makes a lot of sense. It's quite logical. I mean, it's not ideological in the traditional sense, but it has a logic behind it.
I'm afraid to ask you both. I mean, why do you think this has been so far relatively successful? Certainly, if we look in the last 15 years or so, we see this slide away from democracy, the increase of division within democracies, which seems to be the key element which pulls societies apart when people no longer see the governing of your country as a shared endeavor, but really the sharing of the spoils between your side and a common enemy. Why does a country, like Russia with the economy the size of Holland and GDP per capita about the level of Greece, why has it been so relatively successful?
Maybe I can go first. I mean, I think that's true, but of course, Russia doesn't have the mentality of Holland or Greece. It has the mentality of a great power, and it has almost a sense of entitlement to be a great power. And of course, in some respects, it is a great power, particularly in things like strategic nuclear weapons. But I think the reason why this sort of interference and intervention has been successful in the last few years is because the Russians have correctly discerned if you like, political strains of thought and economic problems that have emerged within Western democracies. You can even go as fundamental as saying that, the lack of perceived fairness in the distribution of fruits of economics from globalization is part of this problem, that immigration has been, and multiculturalism have been exploited by the Russians particularly effectively. I notice, ironically, I'm not saying there's necessarily an umbilical link between them, but the fact that, the Leave UK campaign, the Brexit campaign, were arguing that if we stayed in the EU, we'd have up to 80 million Turks coming to Britain, on the one hand, and the fact that the Russians were putting out memes along similar lines on the social media at the time, just shows you that is indeed what they've done. They've managed to ride waves that have already been there, and done so in a very effective way to magnify problems and divisions. And I think that's what they've been very effective at.
Anne, from where you're sitting in Poland, you've written about how the change in politics in Poland has not just consolidated the power of the ruling party, but it has divided families, it's ended friendships, it has pulled people apart. Why do you think people have been so willing to go on this journey?
Well, the experience of polarization and people not speaking to each other is also one that you may well know from Britain. If you live
too well, yes.
Here there's a one of the interesting things about Poland is that it's a completely homogenous country where everybody speaks Polish. It's 99% Catholic. There are no ethnic or tribal divisions, and yet we have a country that has two very clear political tribes, and who each look upon one another as detrimental to the state. The sort of the Law and Justice, which is the ruling party, their tribe sees any opponents as I say, not really Polish, foreign elites. They characterize their opponents as not deserving of power, not even deserving of citizenship, and for the people who oppose them, they're seen as quasi-fascist, anti-democratic, a party that is well outside of any other party that has held power in Poland since 1989. And if you care a lot about Polish democracy, then it's very hard to spend time with people who don't. In the same way that people who cared a lot about the European Union, which is not everybody, stipulate, had a lot of trouble spending time with people who really, really wanted to leave. So you can understand it from the British point of view that it's a little bit like that here. The polarization became very strong. What motivates the members of the ruling party and the followers and the sort of claque of propagandists? That was the topic of my book, and there are many different kinds of reasons. For some people, some people are more ideological. For some people, it's about resentment, feeling that they personally didn't succeed to the degree they felt they should have succeeded since 1989. In some cases, there's their money or personal interests involved. Some people, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there are. The atmosphere around politics is very tribal. you're inside one group or you're inside another group, and therefore you read one set of opinions and facts or another set of opinions and facts, and you very often don't even see the other side. So, again, it's a very profoundly polarized country. Again, very similar in many ways to the United States.
Chris, political division within countries makes it easier to exploit these tensions. And we've spoken about how this recipe can be replicated almost anywhere. Obviously, Germany, the sort of probably the most important individual member of the European Union, has a very close election this month, very close federal election. Do you think we're seeing evidence of Russia seeking to exploit that very close election and the delicate state of the parties there?
Yeah, I think Germany's obviously been a key country for Russia throughout history, but particularly, I think, throughout modern history. And at present time, obviously, the German electoral system tends to produce what one might argue are weak governments, complicated governments, complex governments, shall we say. And Russia has huge interests in Germany. I think Russia has found Germany a relatively easy country to get its way in and to deal with since World War II for various reasons. But it's interesting how in Germany, for example, the Russian interference at the moment seems to be focused upon the leader of the Green Party there, Annalena Baerbock, who, of course, is against Russian gas exports and Nord Stream 2 and so on, and therefore poses quite a serious threat potentially to Russia's, as it were, the regime's economic well-being. And so I think we will see, as we run up to this election, various sort of attempts to interfere, probably in favour of the AfD, but ironically also the FPD, I think, is the Liberal Party there, which is, to my mind, quite surprisingly, one of the most pro-Russian parties in Germany, and an attempt to discredit those who are seen to be potentially threatening Russia's interests in the country, and to hold Russia to account, particularly on a sort of values-based policy rather than an interest-based policy. Russia is always looking to latch on to people whose economic and financial interests it can boost and it can assuage in order to recruit potential allies.
Now, Charles Creel, it's great to have you joining us. You're in Oslo today. On this show, we often talk about both the motivation and the means for causing disruption, and social media's central role in that. I mean, what are your reflections on what Anne and Chris have had to tell us today?
Well, I mean, I think and thank you. It's good to be here again and coming in from Oslo. I think it's interesting that as we talk about this, we haven't really talked about social media, and it can be a bit of a dead horse because we talk about that a lot. But does anyone think this would have been possible without the erosion of our media institutions? And how do we go about rebuilding those now?
Anne, given what's been happening in Poland very recently with the new laws got through the Polish parliament with some difficulty, it appeared, seeking to end foreign ownership of media companies. I mean, do you feel that in a country like Poland, it's both government interference in state media, but also the erosion of the importance of mainstream media through these alternative news sources?
So, I mean, if we're talking specifically about Poland, what we see is a government attack on all independent media. And to be clear, the law about foreign ownership of media is solely and entirely directed at one company. It's directed at the American company that owns Poland's major, most important, actually, television station. It wouldn't affect anybody else. And so it's a law that's written in order to force that company to sell, so that the company can be bought by businessmen or state companies who are close to the ruling party. And so their attack on the media is multi-pronged. It's the takeover of the state media. It's the attempt to undermine private media by depriving them of advertising. People who advertise in the independent media and who also have government business can be threatened or told to stop doing it. Kind of pro-government media is heavily subsidized now by state companies who, through their advertising. So the idea is to make independent media collapse financially, and to eventually have it all taken over by people close to the ruling party. That is that's already happened in Hungary. I should be clear. It's very, very tiny independent media in Hungary. It's just a few websites, really. And that method, that's the same method that Putin used in Russia to destroy kind of the early private media that was born in the 1990s, and that's the tactic. And it's one that can be pretty effective if you have a lot of levers of state power, if you control state companies and they can affect advertising markets and so on.
And Chris, you spoke about Russia will continue with the kind of behaviors that we've been seeing from them until they run into a brick wall. What does the brick wall look like in that context? How do you see that?
It's interesting that we're talking about social media. So, I mean, one of the great issues of the day, of course, is the arguably the Frankenstein's monster that's been let loose by the likes of Twitter and Facebook and Google and so on and so forth, YouTube is a particular one, I think, now of concern as well, in the sense that you've created this kind of anarchic space which can work in a positive sense. If you look at the way in which Twitter was involved in the Arab Spring, for example, you see that there was a positive element to the social media side of this equation. But also the fact that it's very vulnerable for exploitation and manipulation. And for whatever reason, and maybe it's very expensive, difficult, whatever, the big media, big tech companies have not really convinced in terms of policing the social media at all. They're not, for example, legally liable for anything that appears there. And their interventions seem very ad hoc and very random in some ways. When they do intervene, they're quite happy for Donald Trump to say all sorts of things when he was president on Twitter. As soon as he's not president, maybe because he's down, they're prepared to give him a kick. So I think the problem is that, and this is something that you've worked on a lot, I know, Damon, is the way in which the state should and could regulate, and whether there's self-regulation coming in from the big tech companies. And at the moment, we're in this situation where those companies are very powerful and influential in terms of their platforms, but they're not apparently determined or very capable in policing them in the way that they should.
I mean, in some ways, it's extraordinary from the American context that, and although we see this repeated across Europe, that the platforms created by Western businesses, mainly American companies, have been weaponized to create division and affect the outcomes of elections, within our societies.
Yeah, I mean, just to give one crazy example of that, apparently on YouTube there was a fake video of election rigging in the Scottish referendum 7 years ago, which was actually a clip of film taken from vote rigging in St. Petersburg, which is still on YouTube and still titled as such. So that's an extreme example of how the damage is still out there and is still influencing people. And I think we're all quite surprised that the number of people who get their news and their information now from big tech and social media platforms, which don't appear to have the sort of controls and checks and balances that they should have.
I would go a little farther than that. I mean, not only that, their business model, this is particularly true of Facebook, but it's also true of YouTube, which is part of Google. So, but their business model is about encouraging anger, division, and emotion, because that's what keeps people on the platforms. I mean, their goal is to have people staying online as long as possible. Their goal is not to promote democracy or create better conversations or distribute rational, thinking or fact-checked information. That's not what they're for. These are advertising agencies, really. They want you to stay online for a long time and to click on stuff and buy it. And so their business model actually is designed to undermine rational debate. And although they make noises about wanting to control it and constrain it, we've seen even during during the pandemic, they were unable to control disinformation about the coronavirus on their platforms, and in the U.S. they've been unable to control disinformation about the election. So there's something. It's not just an accident that these companies are so easily manipulated by somebody who wants to create emotion and anger, because that's actually what they do. I mean, that's their function. That's why they're different from traditional platforms and other ways in which we traditionally read and get information.
Now, how do you see us getting them on side, Anne? Especially when you have situations where, say, certain parts of the Russian government feel that they're at war with Europe or with the United States, and so much of the activity is being conducted through the big American social media networks.
So the social media networks, under pressure, and do take down at least some, they what they call inauthentic posts. They can work out when one person has made 1,000 of the same comments in the same place and so on. So they do some of that. But I think ultimately the issue is not about taking stuff down or censoring or controlling what's out there. The issue is about regulating the algorithms themselves. which is theoretically possible and is logistically possible. It would take a big effort by government and by universities as well, because there would have to be teams of scientists who are able to do this, to be able to monitor and kind of look inside the black box and change the algorithm so that they favor rational conversation and not just emotion. And the second possible piece for government, and this also could be done at the EU level, or the EU even the level of community of democracies. The other idea would be to start looking at what would a sort of, not the BBC, it's not the BBC exactly, but what would a public interest social media look like? What if social media were designed to create better conversations, to make, to create compromises, to bring people together? And there are, again, a lot of experiments and projects along those lines that have been tried in different places. I mean, eventually something like that may need larger scale backing to be functional and to work. But beginning to think a lot more creatively about how we deal with this is something that I hope is going to happen when we're out of the sort of coronavirus, whatever, post-Brexit continuing crisis that we seem to be in, because it's really something that I hope our political leaders will be looking to in the future.
I mean, I think one of the problems with that has been that where the social media companies, Facebook in particular, have tried to do that, they've seen an improvement on content, but a decline in engagement, and therefore, whenever that choice is offered, they always favor engagement over better regulation of the content.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite complicated. They don't want their users to be, completely scared off by, so they have some interest in keeping the site somehow, not too insane. But yes, I mean, they one also often has the feeling, they talk as if they understand how all this works, and they know, and they can make these adjustments, and but I'm not actually sure they do. I don't know to what degree they understand how people react, or whether their vision of behavioral science is correct. And so it's this is all very new stuff.
I mean, Chris, in your work now, I mean, you speak with people across the NATO countries about security issues, threats to democracy. And how seriously do you take that? And if we take a look at what Anne said earlier on, that Russia have a vision of a divided Europe, of America having withdrawn from Europe. To what extent do you think people in America and in Western Europe look at some of these issues, as Neville Chamberlain said, as arguments about faraway countries that we don't have to worry about?
I think that's very difficult to argue in the modern world, where there's such a lot of interdependence and interlinkage. Communications in particular have meant that we're pretty much living in a global village. And I think democracy's in big trouble. I think that, without sort of being too exaggerating or alarmist, I mean, starting in America, which we're not specifically talking about today, but which makes the climate that we all live under, I think democracy, there is a risk, albeit probably not a likelihood, that democracy in America as we've known it could cease to exist. And if one was looking at a sort of doomsday scenario, you wonder where that would leave Europe if America pulled out of Europe and America ceased to be a democracy and a rule of law state as we've always understood it. In Europe itself, I think, we're in this strange, I would say, vortex of sort of a mix between populism, celebrity and nationalism, which is a pretty dangerous cocktail, and which doesn't lead to good policy making or, good cooperation between European countries, which are obviously much stronger when they act in concert together than they are when they're divided and competing with one another.
And I mean, Anne, as we sort of draw our discussion to a close today, I mean, left unchecked, where do you see Europe in at the end of the 2020s? I mean, do you think these trends left unchecked will continue, and what do you think our response to them should be?
So, I mean, yes, left unchecked, you could get major disintegration. You could get the end of the EU. You could get the end of NATO. You could get the end of democracy in one or more countries in Europe. I mean, we're pretty close already in Hungary. So, as it happens, I don't think they will be all unchecked. I mean, I think there is more awareness now. I mean, certainly, for example, at the EU level, than there was about the dangers ahead. And I'm hoping that, the antibodies kick in the sense that, as people, because I've seen that happen both in the US and in Poland. I mean, as people begin to worry really about the health of their democracy, they become more civically engaged. They become, they care more about what happens, and that begins to change the atmosphere as well. So, nothing is predetermined. I mean, there's no reason why the system has to fall apart, but it does need, I think, some really powerful reforms to make it work better.
Yeah. And Chris, I mean, what do you think from your position? Spent a year studying Russia. What does it take to make Putin take a back step?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, I've been banging on for years about the failure of our deterrence, but a bit like malaria, I think we've got to stop ourselves being bitten now, because I think, as I said earlier, that post 2014, Russia has gone down this path in which it's become an irritant and an agitator in favour of disintegration and disunity in the countries that neighbour it, which are, in themselves should be its main sort of partners and trading and economic contact. So I think that it's difficult at the moment to define exactly what it would be. I think that a lot of it revolves around money and around finance, and the regime leader's ability to launder that money, to invest that money abroad. I think that there is some potential for people who are effectively guardians of that corrupt money and who do feature and operate in the West to be reeled in. I don't see much determination or much motivation at the moment, particularly in post-Brexit Britain, to try and tighten up our regulations and our policing of the international financial system.
I'd like to bring in Phil Howard now into our discussion. We've heard a lot from Chris and Anne about the role of Russian interference across Europe in domestic politics, and also the role that disinformation plays in the rise of populist politics. But I'm particularly interested to see, to what extent is actually social media driving this? Is this a new problem that's been made possible because of social media? Now, as well as running the Oxford Internet Institute, Phil recently published his book, Lie Machines, that looks in particular at the role that the social media platforms play in amplifying conspiracy theories and disinformation. And Phil, I mean, as we look across Europe after this year of COVID, this terrible time we've all been through, what role do you think social media disinformation is playing in politics in Europe?
Well, I think it's a fundamental part of modern political life. I mean, the elected leaders have to contend with misinformation campaigns, and voters have to pay attention to where they're getting their news and information from, because there are so many false news sites, fake news sites, and junk news sites promoting just the strangest things, the wildest conspiracy theories, and trying to misdirect public conversations.
I think it's been interesting looking at the rise of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories as a demonstration of how people can be led to believe things that are not true because of the way they've been exposed to them. Maybe previously people thought with political speech, well, I'd never change how I vote based on something I saw on Facebook. But actually, you can see that disinformation campaigns, powerfully run, can shape the way people see the world.
Absolutely. And especially if like with COVID misinformation, if it plays upon a long-standing anti-vax movement, public distrust in how experts are handling the COVID crisis, public uncertainty, and it's always difficult questions around, how to take care of my kids, how to take care of our family. These are very personal issues, and when there's confusion about masks or confusion about when to self-isolate, or the policies vary, misinformation, the sources of misinformation play up all that confusion, those mixed messages, and make can weaken public understanding, public confidence in health recommendations.
Now, this problem's been around for a while. I mean, we've spoken about this before, and we're aware that social media disinformation exists. The platforms have tried to reassure people they're trying to do more about stopping the spread of malicious disinformation, particularly linked to voter suppression and or incitement for violent acts. But yet it's still out there. And if anything, the problem seems worse than ever before. Looking at some of the studies done of the recent US election, the amplification of misinformation on social media was far greater than the support that was given to legitimate sources of news. I mean, do you think this is actually now a sort of policy failing, which is creating this much bigger problem of a polluted media system, which ecosystem, exactly, where people just don't really know what to believe anymore?
Yeah, it's definitely, it's almost a policy failing. It's definitely a vacuum, I'd say. I mean, it's not too late to fix things, I believe. I do think we're past the point of industry self-regulation, and the heads of these social media firms, most of them themselves, are asking for public policy guidance. We're just waiting for legislatures to deliver on the guidelines. And you're right, it's a pernicious part of modern campaigning. Every major political issue now has an automated troll-based campaign for it or against it, blaming some ethnic group unfairly or trying to take down a public figure for the wrong reasons. It's a complex part of modern political communication.
I mean, is it worse now, do you think, than in the past? I mean, we've had problems of populist movements embracing new technology to spread their ideology, in particular the way in which the Nazis embraced radio in the 1930s. We've seen these sorts of problems in the past. Do you think this is just history repeating itself, or do you think this is of a different magnitude?
I think you've used the word magnitude, and that's the important difference. It's so much faster. It's also out of sight, right? We independent researchers don't have sight of how large these campaigns are. The best metrics we have are on election day or polling instruments, where you can measure the number of people who believe something that's just not true. And I think that the other difference is now the social media platforms are the proximate cause of misinformation. So in the 3 days before an election, it's those platforms that deliver misinformation to voters just when they're supposed to be deliberating. One thing I would say is that the COVID crisis that some of the social media firms appear to have done some positive things in response to the COVID crisis. I would say that muzzling Trump for a period especially because of the health issues, was a positive move. There are other positive things that Facebook in particular is doing. There's still much more data sharing I'd like to see. There's other issues. Climate science is another one in which there's strong scientific consensus about climate change. Are the platforms going to apply the policies that they've put towards COVID, towards climate misinfo? That's uncertain. It's also pretty clear that the platforms will roll out some programs for Canadian voters, but not roll them out for Australian voters, and then not roll them out for European voters. And so getting the platforms to be consistent with what they're offering citizens who vote in democracies is going to be one of the big challenges ahead.
And in that case, I mean, do you think the companies will devote more resource and more attention to countries where this is being talked up as more of an issue, and in countries where it's not, they'll just let it go?
The answer is a qualified yes, in the sense that they will make those offers to the US and US voters, and then they might offer them to other democracies where this is a policy conversation. So the platforms have shown over and over again that they're much more responsive to what the US Senate or what the US House is doing, and even then, they're not always that responsive. But the Canadian government, the Australian government, the UK government, and the firms are wary about what the European Commission will do, right? So a serious antitrust conversation or a serious conversation about market-based nudges, that's happening with the Commission. I think the firms will play it by ear with what other countries do. They'll listen to the US, they'll play it by ear with the other democracies, and we're all sort of waiting to see what the European Commission comes up with.
Now, when we were talking about where in Europe the problem of disinformation, the rise of populism is greater. When we were talking about that earlier, I mean, Anne Applebaum in particular felt that the conditions could be met anywhere. It's not true to say that former Soviet bloc countries are more likely to be vulnerable than other countries in Europe are. But do you think there are criteria that make disinformation campaigns more likely to succeed? Criteria that make it more likely that a country like Russia will seek to interfere in the politics of another country through disinformation?
So I would say that looking across the multiple countries we've studied, the countries where there's a prominent national broadcaster seem to be somewhat inoculated. And I don't mean that the government owns the media. I mean that there's a media institution that gets a healthy chunk of public funding in some way. That the CBC or the BBC or a number of French journalistic outlets that are simply supported by the government, that seems to create a culture of professional journalism that it's not, they don't always behave professionally, but they do behave better than other outlets. And that seems to have a trickle-on effect to create multiple local sources of high-quality news. The countries that don't have that, or the ones that have a lot of private media outlets that can be captured by local elites, I'm thinking Hungary and Poland here, I actually think those are the ones that are susceptible, right? Those are the ones that depend on RT or Sputnik for news pegs, for news stories to run with. France, Germany, the UK, I think we've got those protections of that public broadcaster.
And in your view, is that why we see in some of these countries that you've mentioned actually concerted efforts by the governing regime to undermine and control the media in that country?
Absolutely, and the modern trick is very subtle. It's about controlling ad dollars, right? So, in a lot of Eastern Bloc countries, former Warsaw Pact countries, the main source of revenue for a broadcaster is the government through advertising dollars, public health campaigns. And if the government decides not to do any advertising with a particular media outlet, that crushes it. In a lot of countries also, the broadcast spectrum is allocated to friends of the government. That creates these networks of elites who manage. And I think it's much easier to launch a misinformation campaign in those kinds of countries than it is in countries with an independent culture of professional journalism.
I mean, we see across Europe and certainly elsewhere around the world a trend of, if you like, democracy in retreat. That when the Berlin Wall came down, the communist bloc collapsed. It felt like the ultimate victory for democracy and liberal democracy. That its future doesn't look that rosy now. I mean, how worried do you think we should be by these trends, and do you think they will continue and even worsen in different countries?
I think we should be worried. I think it's safe to say that the world's 4 or 5 largest democracies are under threat, or as you say, democracies in retreat. I'm thinking of India and Indonesia, certainly the United States with the changing appetite for voter, making it easy to vote. Mexico as well. The largest democracies are under threat, I think, by misinformation. It creates these communities of voters who just who make poor decisions, and they elect leaders who want to go with their guts rather than think about evidence-based policymaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, I think, in America, how many people that voted Republican actively believe that Donald Trump won the election and it was stolen from him. And in a way, we look at the growing strength of conspiracy networks like QAnon. Again, impossible to believe that those sorts of networks could have been created so quickly without social media.
Absolutely, it's the key coordination tool. It's it's cheap to start up a campaign. You can A/B test the messaging with images. Journalists, lawmakers, academics have no sight of visual misinformation on Instagram, right? Instagram never shares that stuff. We barely understand TikTok's role in this. And, the things I'm worried about actually the next generation of voters. So you and I, and even the people who are voting age now, have our media. We've got our political identities in shape. But the 12 to 16, 17 crowd, they're forming their political identity on TikTok. What is the misinfo situation on TikTok? We don't really know. WhatsApp, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I'm worried about the next generation of voters.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we've seen this in the studies looking in Brazil and India in particular about the role WhatsApp plays, and you're right. These are channels that that no one else can see into. They're purely personalized for the person that's receiving the messages, and again, sort of content that is personalized around the user's data profile that they're targeted with on TikTok or Instagram. It's very difficult to get any sight of what that might be.
yeah, I think that's why we're waiting for the rules to come into place. We need rules that'll cover a couple of platforms well and guide everyone and point everybody in the right direction.
I mean, we're in Parliament now. We're starting the process of scrutinising the online safety bill. A key component of that is looking at what powers the regulators should have. Now, there have been calls for a long time for research institutions, universities to have more access to data. I mean, at the moment, how difficult is it to do meaningful research into these issues and how the social media companies work with them?
I would say that a lot of our work doesn't meet the contemporary scientific standards that other research in other domains meets. These platforms don't tell us much about the sampling statistics for the data they hand over. They rarely hand things over. Twitter is accessible, but not all communities use Twitter, right? And the kids these days, they don't really use Twitter. We don't have sight of the visual, as I mentioned earlier, visual misinformation. We know that's in circulation now. Actually, we also know that the Russian government's misinformation strategy has moved on to Instagram and visual misinformation, but we have no sight of that content. So, I think we get a broad sketch, we get qualitative interview-based research out there, but until there's systematic sharing through a publicly trusted body like UKRI, we're far from where we need to be with understanding the problem.
Which is concerning when we consider actually some of these issues are quite fundamental about the health of democracy in society, the ability to make sure people are properly informed about the issues they need to decide on when they vote or during a public health emergency. It's concerning that there's so much about the way information is distributed that we just don't know anything about.
Yep, absolutely. And I think for an academic, a researcher, or a journalist in this country, there's professional norms about how to conduct a major research study. And I think if a researcher at a decent university can go through the peer review process, the ethics review process, get public funding to do the science from UKRI, they've already gone through more ethics and public oversight than any Facebook data scientist has ever had, right? And so having a properly anonymized, properly hashed data set that's representative, that helps us dig into the problems, and helps identify solutions, right? Because ultimately that's what this is about. Till we get that data access, where we have to trust that the platforms are telling us, giving us accurate info about what's going on.
Yeah, and I think we've reached a point where we recognise that is not a satisfactory state of affairs. Exactly right. Yeah. Phil, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been great to talk to you.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Great to see you.
You've been listening to the Infotagion Inside Europe podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, and featuring Anne Applebaum, Chris Steele, Charles Creel, and Phil Howard. The show was produced by David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion by visiting our website, infotagion.com, and also support this series by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. All of the proceeds raised will go towards the making of the show. Thank you. Until next time.